"I'll die before I wed that plain thing," said the Duke of Rosemont, and the library door had not quite caught its latch, so the words came whole and unkind down the passage to where Lynette Bray stood with a tray of unopened correspondence balanced against her hip. She did not drop the tray. 26 years had taught her not to drop things, and a sentence, however well aimed, was not going to be the exception that undid the lesson. She would remember afterward that her first thought was not of herself, but of the ink drying crooked on the topmost letter, and that this told her something about her own heart she was not yet ready to examine. She did not yet know what the sentence would cost the man who had spoken it, nor what it would cost her to go on pretending she had not heard it. Had she known, she might have knocked before she listened. She did not know. She only stood very still, which was the one trick she had ever properly mastered. Beyond the door, a second voice answered him, dry as a lawyer's brief, because it belonged to one. "Then your Grace had better die interestingly," said Mr. Aldous Fenn, "for the alternative, as your grandfather wrote it, is that you die a duke of nothing at all. The almshouses, the hospital at Aldercombe, the relief fund your own father built, every unentailed shilling of it passes in trust to young Master Esher the day after Candlemas, and Lady Esher administers the whole of it until the boy is 25. You have, by my reckoning, until the 2nd of February to be a married man. Not engaged, sir, married. The banns must be called 3 Sundays running, which means you have until the 3rd Sunday of Advent to post them, or the law will not oblige you in time, whatever your inclination." "I am aware of the arithmetic, Fenn." The Duke's voice did not rise. It never did. That was the thing the county said of him, when the county said anything kind at all, that Alaric Vane had never in his life needed to shout to be obeyed. "Her Grace my grandmother has a candidate." "I am aware of that also." "Miss Bray is honest, capable, unconnected, and no more taken with society than society has been taken with her," said Fenn evenly. A man reading a brief he had already half won. It would end the matter within the fortnight, and end it cleanly. "You will not use her to solve my grandfather's sum," said the Duke. "Find another one." A pause. The particular pause of a man deciding whether a door is worth pushing twice. Then, quieter, meant for no one but the room, "I'll die before I wed that plain thing. Find someone the world hasn't already used up." It was at that moment that Mrs. Prudence Sedley came round the passage corner at her customary speed, which was that of a woman perpetually late for an appointment she had invented herself, and found her niece standing like a caryatid with a tray of letters and a face gone carefully, deliberately smooth. "You have heard something," said Mrs. Sedley, who had buried a husband, outlived 2 dogs, and never once in 61 years failed to notice when a room had turned against someone. "I have heard nothing, Aunt," said Lynette. "You have heard something, and you are standing like a woman balancing a full cup she does not mean to spill. Come away from the door. Whatever it was, it will keep." It would not keep, though Lynette did not say so. She let herself be steered down the passage, past the tall windows where the last of the harvest light lay gold and thick across the floorboards, and set the tray upon the hall table with a precision that squared its corners exactly with the table's edge, because squaring things was the second trick she owned, after stillness, and she had needed both in the last 10 minutes. She was 26, the only child of Josiah Bray, who had kept the Rosemont accounts for 30 years with a hand so clean that the old Duke used to say a man could shave in the reflection of his columns, and who had died 3 winters past leaving his daughter a small annuity, a large reputation, and no means of living on either. She kept books now for half the parish, for pin money and out of habit, because a mind trained to find the error in a column of figures does not simply stop looking once the wages stop. It was that reputation, and not her face, that had brought her to Rosemont Hall 3 days before, summoned by a note in the Dowager Duchess Augusta's own trembling hand. The relief fund ledgers had not balanced in a year. And her Grace trusted no eye at Rosemont to find the fault but a braze. Linnet had come for the columns. She had not come to be discussed as a solution to an entail, still less to be dismissed as one in a voice that did not even trouble to lower itself for shame. Candlemas was 17 weeks off. She did not yet reckon it in weeks. That would come later, when the counting became a habit she could not put down, but she understood. Standing there with her hands laid flat and steady on the table's edge, that whatever had just happened behind that door, the whole of Rosemont was going to be made to answer for it before the 2nd of February, and that she, plain thing that she apparently was, had somehow already been drawn into the reckoning. Her aunt did not let the silence stand for long. "Whoever he is," said Mrs. Sedley, watching her niece's face with the frank, unhurried attention of a woman pricing a horse, "he is a fool, and fools are cheaper by the dozen than you think. Sit down. Eat something." A body cannot be dignified on an empty stomach, I have tried, in my youth, and it does not answer. Linnet almost smiled. That was the other mercy of Prudence Sedley. She made a joke land exactly where the wound was, so that the laugh and the ache arrived together and somehow canceled a portion of each other out. "I am perfectly dignified, Aunt. You are perfectly upright, which is not the same thing, and you have gone the color of a candle that has just been snuffed." Mrs. Sedley took her by the elbow, propelling her toward the small parlor where the Dowager Duchess liked to take her tea away from the noise of a full house. "Whatever was said, it was not said to you. Doors carry a man's meanness further than his manners, that is all, and no sensible woman drowns in water that was never poured for her." Linnet let herself be led, and said nothing of what she had actually heard, because some sentences, once repeated aloud, take on a second life crueler than the first, and she was not yet ready to give this one that gift. She only thought, with the particular clarity of a woman who kept ledgers for a living, that she had exactly 119 days until Candlemas, and that a man did not use that word, die, so carelessly about a date already circled in his own grandfather's will, unless the sum troubling him ran a good deal deeper than her own plain face. The tea in the small parlor was, as always, too strong, and the Dowager Duchess Augusta liked it that way on principle, the way she liked most things that made younger people wince. She was propped among cushions with the particular fierce frailty of a woman who had once run a household of 40 servants on the strength of her eyebrows alone, and she looked up when Linnet entered with an expression that missed nothing, least of all the color still not fully returned to the girl's cheeks. "You have found something in the ledgers," said the Duchess, mistaking the cause, which suited Linnet well enough for the moment. "I have found several somethings, Your Grace," said Linnet, grateful for a true answer that was also a shelter. "The relief fund entries for the last 12 months are in a hand that wishes very hard to be Mr. Coombs' ordinary hand, and mostly succeeds. But my father taught me to read a column the way other people read a face, and there is a fault in it a stranger would miss, and a daughter cannot." "Then you will keep looking," said the Duchess, "and you will tell no one what you find until you are certain of it, because in this house, child, certainty is the only currency that cannot be counterfeited. I did not summon you here for your beauty. I summoned you because your father could smell a false sum from across a room, and I am told the gift runs in blood as often as it runs in training." She reached out one ringed, spotted hand and closed it, with surprising strength, over Linnet's own. Whatever else you hear said in this house between now and Candlemas, and you will hear things, I do not doubt it. This is not a quiet house just now. I would have you remember that the truest sentence in it will very likely be the last one spoken, not the first. It was, Lynette thought afterward, the nearest thing to a warning anyone troubled to give her, and she did not understand it half so well as she believed she did. The second private duel came 4 days later, over the ledgers themselves, in the estate office at the cold end of the house where the fire never quite reached the corners. Lynette had asked for an hour of the steward's books undisturbed, and had been given, instead, the Duke. He came in without knocking, which she noted, and stopped when he saw her at his grandfather's old desk, with 3 years of accounts fanned before her like a hand of cards. Miss Bray. He said it the way a man says a fact he has just been handed and has not yet decided whether to believe. I understood you were engaged elsewhere. I am engaged here, Your Grace, at Her Grace your grandmother's request, and I will thank you not to disturb the order of these pages, as it took me the better part of a morning to build it. She did not look up. It was, she would admit only to herself, a small and satisfying cruelty, the kind available to a woman with nothing else to bargain with. He crossed the room anyway, and stood on the far side of the desk, close enough that she caught, under the cold, the ordinary smell of him, leather and wood smoke, a man who worked his own home farm with his own hands more often than his rank required. You will forgive me, he said, if I ask what a companion's niece finds so absorbing in my tenant relief accounts that she requires a morning and a locked door. You will forgive me, she said, matching him syllable for syllable. Because two could play at that particular game, and she had learned it at her father's knee before she learned her letters, if I declined to discuss unproven suspicions with the one person in this house who benefits least from having them proven. That drew his eyes up properly for the first time, gray and considering, the eyes of a man weighing whether he had just been insulted or complimented and finding, to his visible discomfort, that it was somehow both. You think me capable of falsifying my own father's charity fund? I think nothing yet. I think in figures, Your Grace, not in men. And the figures are not finished speaking, then let them speak faster, he said, for I have a deadline you may have heard mentioned, and something in his voice, dry as it was, carried an edge close enough to raw that she glanced up despite herself. I have heard it mentioned, she said, rather more plainly than I would have wished. A silence opened between them, thin as ice on a horse trough, and for one unguarded moment she thought he understood exactly what she meant, and was ashamed of it. He did not apologize. Dukes, she was learning, rarely did, not because they lacked the grace, but because the word cost more than they had been raised to spend. What he did instead was pull out the chair across from her, sit without being asked, and say, in a voice gone suddenly plain of all its armor, show me the fault then. If I am to be accused in my grandfather's own study, I would rather see the evidence than hear it secondhand from Fen. It was not an apology. It was, she would come to understand, the nearest thing this particular man had to offer instead of one, the surrender of his own time, his own attention, laid down like a coin on the table between them, and against her better judgment, she found it very nearly enough. The estate office became, over the next fortnight, a kind of neutral country between them, the one room in Rosemont Hall where rank and reputation were set aside at the door like wet boots. He came most evenings after his own work was done, smelling of the home farm, his hands, broad, calloused, a laborer's hands wedded incongruously to a signet ring, flat on the desk while she walked him through the columns line by line. "Here," she said one night, sliding a page toward him and tapping a figure with one ink-stained finger, "is where the relief dispersed to the almshouse at Aldercombe in March does not match the sum recorded as received a fortnight later." £11, 6 shillings, vanished between the giving and the getting. A clerical slip, perhaps, but here, she turned 2 pages back, is the same slip to the shilling in November. And here, in July. A slip that repeats itself with that precision is not a slip, Your Grace, it is a habit. He was quiet long enough that she looked up from the page to his face and found him studying her instead of the ledger, with an expression she could not yet read and did not entirely trust herself to try. "My father built that fund," he said finally, "the year my mother died, because he said a duke who could not keep his own tenants from starving in a hard winter had no business calling himself one." I was 11. I remember him telling me that a man's honor is the one ledger that is never audited by anyone but himself, and so it is the one he must keep honestly whether or not he is ever caught. "That is a fine maxim for a father to leave a son," she said. "It is a heavy one to carry when someone appears to be stealing from the very fund he built to prove it." Something crossed his face then, quick as a bird's shadow, not surprise, she thought, but recognition, as though she had said aloud a thing he had already half suspected and had not wanted confirmed by a stranger's clean-handed columns. He did not tell her what he suspected, or whom. He only closed the ledger gently, the way a man closes a door on a room he is not yet ready to enter, and said, "Keep looking, Miss Bray. And keep it to this room if you would. There are people in this house who would call your honesty an inconvenience, and I would rather you were not made to answer for it before I understand it myself." It was the first time he had asked her for anything as though her answer mattered to him personally, rather than dynastically, and she went to bed that night turning the sentence over like a coin whose true value she had not yet learned to read, entirely unaware that somewhere else in the house a much colder hand was already writing her name into a different sort of ledger altogether. Lady Delphine Vane, the widowed Marchioness of Esher, had a voice that poured like cream and a smile that never once reached the flat, watchful blue of her eyes, and she found Lynette 3 mornings later in the rose walk behind the orangery, where the last blooms were going brown at the edges in the October cold. "Miss Bray, how industrious you are, even at breakfast hour, though I confess I had heard you kept rather to the estate office these days." She fell into step without invitation, her morning silks. She had worn unrelieved black bombazine the whole 11 years since her husband's death, a fact the county found either very touching or very convenient, depending on how well it liked her that week, whispering over the gravel. "Her Grace's ledgers do not audit themselves," said Lynette, matching the pace, refusing the smaller courtesy of slowing to be managed. "No, I don't suppose they do. It is such a comfort to Augusta, having someone of your application to hand. I only wonder," and here Lady Esher paused to admire a rose that was not worth admiring, a habit Lynette would come to recognize as the woman's particular gift, the art of making cruelty look like idle conversation, whether it is entirely wise for a young woman with her own name to protect, to be seen quite so often in the estate office of an unmarried duke. "The world is unkind to plain girls who reach above themselves, Miss Bray. I have watched it happen. It leaves a mark that never quite fades, however innocent the reaching. I am not reaching for anything but an honest column, Lady Esher. Of course you are not." The smile widened, warmed, and told Lynette nothing whatsoever true. "I only meant it kindly. Little Peter and I have so few friends left in this house who remember what it is to be spoken of unkindly behind a closed door. I should hate for you to learn it too." She touched Lynette's sleeve, lightly, the gesture of an intimate, and was gone up the path toward the house before Lynette could decide whether she had just been threatened or embraced, though her instinct, sound as it had always been with figures and nearly as sound with faces, told her it had been rather more of the former than the latter. That same afternoon, passing the estate office with an armful of linen, she heard through the half-open door Lady Esher's voice again, dropped to a register meant for no one. "You will have the March figures reconciled to my copy by Friday. Mr. Coombe, and not to his. His Grace has enough occupying his attention just now, without troubling himself over £11, and a man's voice, thin and hurried, agreeing, and Lynette stood in the passage with the linen going heavy in her arms, understanding for the first time that the fault in the ledgers had a face, and that the face wore black silk and smiled at roses that were not worth admiring. She did not tell the Duke that evening. She told herself it was because she was not yet certain, which was true, and also because some new and unfamiliar caution had begun advising her, quietly, to hold one card back from every hand she played in that house, even the hands dealt with him. Perhaps especially those. What she did instead was begin a private page of her own, in her father's old daybook, the slim green-bound ledger he had carried in his coat pocket for 30 years, and which she had carried in hers since his death, out of habit as much as love. It had a code inside its end papers, tick marks and initials her father had devised, so that no clerk copying his figures could ever quite counterfeit the logic beneath them, and she began, that night by candlelight, to set Lady Esher's name against the discrepancies one by one, in a hand small enough to hide and honest enough to hang a person, should it ever need to. She did not yet know how soon it would. The evenings in the estate office went on being the warmest hour of each of Lynette's days, though she was careful, even in the privacy of her own thoughts, not to call it that outright. There was, on a night in early November, with rain working itself up against the windows, a moment she would return to often afterward. The Duke, bent over a column of his own father's handwriting, said suddenly, and without any preamble at all, "You are the first person in 2 years to sit in this room and tell me the truth, without first calculating what it would cost me to hear it," and then, before she could answer, added, low and almost startled at himself, "I do not know what to do with that. I have grown so used to being managed that honesty feels, at first, rather like being struck. I am sorry to strike you, Your Grace. Don't be." He looked up, and the corner of his mouth moved in something that was very nearly, for the first time since she had known him, an actual smile. It is a better feeling than the alternative. I had forgotten that. She found, to her own considerable alarm, that she wanted very much to be the one who reminded him of it again. It was in that same sitting that she risked the question she had been carrying, folded small, since the library door in September. "May I ask Your Grace something impertinent? You have asked me a dozen impertinent things already this fortnight. One more will hardly signify. Why did you say—" She stopped, recalibrated, chose the coward's route and the honest one at once. "Why did Your Grace refuse your grandmother's suggestion that first week I came so very absolutely? I only wonder what made the notion so intolerable." Something shuddered behind his eyes, quick as a hand closing over a candle. "Because there is a thing in this house I cannot yet lay before you, Miss Bray. And until I can, it would be a cruelty to let anyone close enough to be struck by it in my place. That is not an answer." "No," he agreed. "It is a promise instead, which I hope you will find, in time, the better bargain." He did not elaborate, and a knock at the door, Fenn with a dispatch from London requiring signature before the post, ended the evening before she could press him further, so that she went to bed with the sentence unfinished, and the ache of its unfinishing, keeping her awake rather longer than the ledgers ever had. The blow, when it came, arrived dressed as kindness, which she was learning by now to be Lady Esher's favorite costume. It came at the Candlemas assembly in the village hall at Aldercombe, where half the county had gathered under greenery and candlelight to dance off the last of the harvest, and where Lady Esher, resplendent and correct in her 11 years of black, drew Lynette aside during a pause in the music with an arm laced confidingly through hers. "I have heard the most curious thing, Miss Bray, and I could not in conscience keep it from you, knowing how you honor your father's memory. It is being said, I do not say by whom, for I would not repeat gossip, only warn a friend against its consequences, that the discrepancies in the relief accounts predate Mr. Coombs' tenure entirely, that they begin, in fact, in the last year of your own father's stewardship, when his hand, they say, had begun to fail him, and his sums with it." The music went on somewhere behind them, bright and entirely indifferent, and Lynette felt the words land the way a blow lands on a body already braced for something else, in a place she had not thought to guard. "That is a lie." "I am certain it is," said Lady Esher, with a gentleness that was somehow the cruelest thing she had yet done, "and I am equally certain that certainty will matter very little once the rumor has made its rounds of every card table in the county. It is a hard thing, is it not, to have spent one's life building a name only to watch it become a coin other people spend without asking. I only tell you so that you may be prepared, and because, forgive me for saying so. A young woman so very determined to prove her honesty by ruining the reputations of the living might do well to consider what it costs to go on excavating the dead. She pressed Lynette's arm once, kindly, and drifted back toward the dancing, leaving Lynette standing very still in the candlelight with her father's name suddenly, impossibly, on trial alongside the account books he had kept clean for 30 years, and the terrible new understanding, cold as the November air outside the hall's tall windows, that the very gift which made her useful to this house had just been turned, with one soft sentence, into a blade pointed back at the only thing she had left of him. She did not sleep that night, and she did not, for 3 days afterward, go near the estate office at all, though she told herself it was pride and not fear that kept her from it, a distinction that grew thinner with each hour she examined it. It was her aunt who finally cornered the truth out of her, over a cold Tuesday breakfast, with the particular relentlessness of a woman who had raised no children of her own, and had therefore perfected the art on nieces instead. You have not touched your tea in 3 days, you have not been near that house, and you flinch when anyone mentions your father's name, which I have never in your life seen you do, not even at his funeral. Tell me what has been said, or I shall go to Rosemont Hall myself and ask Lady Esher directly, and I promise you I will not be gentle about it. So Lynette told her, the whole of it, and watched her aunt's face go from its ordinary dry composure into something flinty and precise that Lynette had seen perhaps twice before in her life. Your father, said Mrs. Sedley, kept the books at Rosemont for 30 years without a blot, and I sat across from him at whist every Thursday for the last 5 of them, and I promise you, child, whatever failed in that man at the end, it was not his arithmetic. That woman is testing which lever moves you. You will not give her the satisfaction of watching it work. It is already working, Aunt. Then stop it working where she can see, and start proving it a lie where she cannot. Mrs. Sedley set down her cup with a decisiveness that rattled the saucer. You have his old day book. You have his code. Somewhere in 30 years of his own honest hand is the proof that the failing, whatever it was, began after him, and not before. Go and find it, and stop weeping into your tea over a sentence a wicked woman built on purpose to stop you looking any further." It was, Lynette reflected afterward, exactly the sort of blunt courage she had come to rely on in her aunt, delivered with exactly the sort of tenderness that made it possible to hear, and it was that same night. Returning at last to the estate office with her father's daybook under her arm and a new, harder resolve in her chest, that she found the Duke waiting for her, and Lady Esher, unexpectedly, waiting also, with an offer that would cost Lynette a great deal more than her pride to refuse. Miss Bray. Lady Esher rose from the chair by the cold hearth as though she had been expecting her, which Lynette understood at once she had. The Duke was not in the room, she noted that first, and felt the absence like a missing plank in a floor she had thought solid. "I hoped we might speak without an audience. I understand you have been unwell. I have been occupied, Lady Esher. Occupied, yes," the smile again, warm and empty as a snuffed lamp. "I will be direct with you, Miss Bray, because I think you are a woman who prefers it, whatever the cost of directness. I am prepared to see your father's name cleared of every whisper I may, entirely by accident, have set moving, and I am prepared to settle upon you a sum sufficient to keep your aunt in comfort for the whole of her natural life, on one very simple condition: that you leave Rosemont Hall this week and trouble the estate ledgers and this family no further. And if I decline, then I fear the whisper will go on growing of its own accord, as whispers do, and I will no longer be in any position to stop it, having done what small good I could." Lynette stood with her father's daybook pressed against her ribs like a shield and felt, for one long, dizzying moment, the genuine weight of the offer, her aunt's old age made soft and safe, her father's name scrubbed clean in every drawing room in the county, at the cost only of walking away from a column of figures that was not, after all, any business of hers. She thought of her father's hand in the daybook against her ribs, 30 years of honest tick marks. She thought of the Duke's voice saying, "There is a thing in this house I cannot yet lay before you," and understood, with sudden and complete clarity, that whatever that thing was, walking away now would leave it forever unspoken, and leave Lady Esher's hand forever on the ledger unchallenged. "No," she said. "I will not be paid to stop counting, Lady Esher. My father taught me that a ledger is the one place a lie cannot live comfortably for long, and I find, to my own surprise, that I believe him rather more than I fear you." Something flickered, fast and ugly, beneath the Marchioness's composure, the first true thing Lynette had ever seen cross that immaculate face, before the smile smoothed itself back into place. "Then, I am sorry for you, Miss Bray. I truly am." She left without another word, and Lynette stood alone in the cold office for a long while afterward, her hands not quite steady, understanding that she had just refused the only safe exit that would ever be offered her, and that whatever came next would come at full cost, with no purchase price left to bargain down. The cost arrived within the week, and it arrived, as such things do in a great house, dressed in the language of propriety. Lynette was informed by the housekeeper, with visible discomfort, that Her Grace the Dowager Duchess had taken a chill and could not receive visitors, and that in consequence Miss Bray's services in the estate office would no longer be required. No one told her, though everyone in the servants' hall already knew, that the true instruction had come not from the ailing Duchess, but from Lady Esher, who had gone to the Duke that same morning with a sheaf of papers and the calm, sorrowful face of a woman performing a distasteful duty, and told him that the steward's daughter he had been keeping such long private hours with had been discovered, upon careful examination, to have altered 2 entries in the very ledgers she claimed to be correcting, A small thing, she said, a young woman's understandable temptation to protect her father's memory by quietly erasing the evidence against it. But a thing that could not surely be overlooked by a man about to stake his family's honor on a marriage. Lynette did not learn the particulars until she arrived at the front door the following morning and was turned away on the step by a footman who would not meet her eyes, with a note in the Duke's own hand, cold, correct. Utterly unlike the voice she had come to know across the estate desk, informing her that her assistance was no longer required and that any further ledgers in her possession were to be returned at her earliest convenience. She stood on the gravel with the note shaking very slightly in her hand and felt something close over in her chest that she recognized, distantly, as the sound of a door she had genuinely believed was opening, shutting instead with the particular finality of a lock turning from the inside. She did not weep. Anger would have been easier, and she reached for it instead, walking the long mile back to her aunt's cottage with her father's daybook clutched so tightly against her ribs that the corners left marks she found later, faint and blue, like a bruise from something that had tried and nearly succeeded in breaking her. It was 2 days after that, with the whole county now murmuring cheerfully of the steward's daughter turned forger, that a boy from the Rosemont stables came pounding on her aunt's door at dusk, with a letter sealed in wax, gone soft from being carried at a run, and no name on the outside but her own, in a hand she did not recognize but would come, before the letter's contents were half read. To trust with everything she had left, the Dowager Duchess Augusta was asking for her, at once and alone, before it was too late to matter. Lynette went that same night, in her aunt's borrowed cloak, against a wind that smelled, for the first time that autumn, of coming snow, and found the Dowager Duchess propped high on her pillows, with a face gone gray, but her eyes as sharp as ever they had been over the teacups in September. "Sit," said the Duchess, before Lynette had even closed the door, "and do not waste breath telling me you were dismissed for forgery, because I have known Josiah Bray's daughter for a fortnight, and I have known Delphine Vane for 11 years, and I promise you I know which of the two has practiced a false hand longer." She gestured with visible effort at a small locked box on the table beside her bed. "There is a key in the top drawer of that dressing table. Open the box." Inside, beneath a folded shawl gone soft with age, lay a bundle of letters tied with faded ribbon, and beneath those, a single sheet in a hand Lynette did not know but felt, immediately, the shape of, round, careful, and not quite steady, as though written by someone copying rather than composing. "That," said the Duchess, "is an instruction in Delphine's own hand addressed to Mr. Coombe, directing the alteration of the March disbursement 3 years running, which my late maid discovered by accident when the drawer of Mr. Coombe's own desk stuck fast and would not close, and which she brought to me rather than to anyone who might have silenced her for it. I have kept it against a day I hoped never to need it. I am an old woman with a bad heart and a grandson who will not save himself for stubbornness, and I cannot go before that man and his solicitors and swear to a hand I only half remember. But you can read a hand the way other people read a face. Child, tell me plainly, is that Delphine Vane's writing, or is it not?" Lynette took the sheet with hands that had gone, for the first time in weeks, entirely steady, and held it beside 3 pages from her father's daybook, and felt the last piece of a puzzle she had been assembling for 2 months settle, with a small and terrible click, into place. "It is hers," she said. "The forger who copied Mr. Coombe's hand in the ledgers is skilled, Your Grace, skilled enough to fool a stranger, but no one forges their own true hand by accident, and this," she tapped the looping, unsteady round hand of the instruction, "this is not Mr. Coombe's forgery of anything. This is Lady Esher." writing in haste to herself. The Duchess closed her eyes, and for one dreadful moment Lynette thought she had waited too long to hear it. Then the old woman's hand found hers and gripped it, harder than seemed possible in a body so frail. "Then we have 4 weeks until Candlemas," she said, "and a great deal of work to do before the light runs out, in every sense of the phrase. Fetch my grandson. And fetch Fen. It is time this family's arithmetic was done in the open, before witnesses, where no one can quietly alter the sum afterward." What followed was not swift, because true proof, Lynette was learning, moves at the pace of the careful rather than the pace of the desperate, however desperate the clock made everyone feel. The Duke came within the hour, summoned from the home farm still in his working coat, and stood in his grandmother's chamber, reading the letter Lynette held out to him with a stillness that told her, more clearly than any outburst could have, exactly how much it cost him to hold his face steady while he read it. "She has been bleeding my father's charity for 3 years," he said finally, very quietly, "under my own roof, while I stood in a library and told Fen I would rather die than endanger one more person by letting them near this house." He looked up at Lynette then, and something in his expression made her understand, with a sudden rush of comprehension that arrived far too late to spare her the weeks of hurt that had preceded it, exactly what he had meant that September evening by a thing I cannot yet lay before you. "There was a woman before you," he said, low, as though the words had waited a long time behind his teeth for permission. "Not a wife. A friend of my sister's, the year after my brother died, whom I was foolish and young enough to favor openly, before I understood what Delphine does to anyone I favor. She was ruined within a season on evidence I never proved false until it was too late to matter to her. I swore after that I would not do it twice. I said what I said in that library because I meant to keep you at arm's length from a danger I had already watched destroy someone once, not because I believed a single word of it." "You might have told me," Lynette said, and heard her own voice crack on the last word despite every effort to hold it level. "I might have," he agreed, "and I have spent every week since regretting that I did not, and watching the cost of my silence fall on you instead of on me, which was never the bargain I meant to strike." "Mr." Fen cleared his throat from the doorway, where he had arrived, papers in hand, in time to catch the tail of a confession he was tactful enough not to remark upon. "Your Grace." "Miss Bray, if the letter is what her Grace believes it to be, then we do not merely have grounds to clear Miss Bray's name and her father's both. We have grounds to remove Lady Esher from any position of trust in this estate before Candlemas ever arrives, but only if we can bring Mr. Combe to admit, before witnesses, whose hand truly directed his. A letter alone, however damning, can be called a forgery in turn. A confession cannot." "Then we get the confession," said the Duke, and something had entered his voice that Lynette had not heard there before, not the cold correctness of the note that had turned her away from his door, nor the careful warmth of the estate office, but a flat, settled resolve, the voice of a man who had finally stopped protecting people by keeping them in the dark and decided, at considerable risk to himself, to drag the whole matter into the light instead. In the open, before witnesses, where no one can alter the sum afterward. My grandmother's own prescription. We shall see if it cures what ails this family, as well as it seems to have already cured what ails me. The plan Lynette built over the next 10 days was, she would admit afterward, the proudest piece of work she had done since her father's death, and it was built, deliberately, around Mr. Combe rather than around Lady Esher, because a frightened man, her father had always said, breaks faster than a proud woman, and Combe had been frightened, in Lynette's private estimation. Since the night she overheard him agreeing to falsify the March figures in a voice too thin for a man at ease with his own conscience. She wrote to him herself, in her father's old formal hand, requesting, as a courtesy, nothing more, that he bring the original relief fund receipts to a meeting of the trust's overseers before Candlemas, so that the transfer of administration, whichever way it fell, might begin on unimpeachable footing. It was a request no honest clerk could refuse without suspicion, and Coombe, not being an especially brave man, did not refuse it. Miss Cordelia Fairfax, whom half the county had confidently expected to be announced as the new Duchess of Rosemont before the autumn was out, called on Linnet unannounced 3 days before the gathering, arriving in a temper that surprised them both. "I am told you have been telling people I withdrew my own interest in the Duke on Lady Esher's advice," she said, without preamble, standing very straight in Mrs. Sedley's small parlor as though bracing for a blow. "I have told people no such thing, Miss Fairfax. No, I don't suppose you have. It was Lady Esher who told me, in the spring, that his Grace's affections lay elsewhere, and that I would only humiliate myself by persisting, and I believed her, because it was easier than doubting a woman who had been so very kind to me." Cordelia's composure cracked, briefly, into something younger and rawer than her polished manner usually allowed. "I have since had cause to wonder whether kindness was ever the correct word for it. If there is to be a reckoning, Miss Bray, I find I should like to be present. I have questions of my own for Lady Esher that have waited a great deal too long to be asked." Linnet, recognizing in the other woman's anger the particular fury of someone who has only just understood she was used, rather than befriended, offered her a chair and, for the first time in the whole of their brief and glittering rivalry, an honest welcome. Mrs. Sedley, meanwhile, performed the quiet piece of courage that would prove, in the end, decisive. She carried the Dowager Duchess's letter and Josiah Bray's daybook herself, sewn into the lining of her old cloak, past Lady Esher's own maid, who had been instructed, Linnet later learned, to search any bag or basket leaving the hall on Linnet's account, walking the 2 miles to Mr. Fenn's chambers on foot in a hard December rain, rather than trust the evidence to any carriage that might be turned back or searched along the way. "I am an old woman," she said, when Linnet tried afterward to thank her, wringing rain from her hem before the fire. "And old women are searched a great deal less thoroughly than young ones, which is very nearly the only advantage age has yet shown me. Do not waste it thanking me, waste it winning." By the eve of the gathering, every piece Linnet needed was assembled, the forged and the true entries laid side by side. Her father's code proving the discrepancies began a full year after his death, and not before. The Dowager Duchess's letter in Lady Esher's own unsteady hand, and Mr. Coombe, summoned unknowing to a room that would very shortly ask him one question he had no honest way left to answer. The only piece missing, Linnet realized as she blew out her candle that last night, was the shape her own courage would need to take when the question came to her, as she was quite certain it would. In front of the whole assembled county, the great hall at Rosemont was arranged, on the appointed morning, not for a ball but for a tribunal, though no one called it that aloud, the trust's overseers seated in a row of borrowed chairs, Mr. Fenn at a small table with his papers squared before him, the Dowager Duchess brought down on a wheeled chair against her physician's every objection, and behind them, filling the benches, the whole curious weight of the county's gentry, drawn by rumor of a reckoning the way a storm draws birds ahead of it. Lady Esher arrived last, in unrelieved black, composed as a portrait, with little Peter's hand held correctly in hers, as though the boy's presence alone might armor her. "I confess myself at a loss," she said, once the room had settled, her voice pitched to carry with just the right note of wounded patience, as to why a private matter of estate bookkeeping requires so very public an audience. Surely Mr. Fenn's usual quiet methods would have served. Because quiet methods, Lady Escher, are precisely how a sum gets altered twice, without anyone noticing the second time, said Fenn, and laid the first document on the table between them, the March disbursement entry, in Mr. Comb's practiced imitative hand. Mr. Combe, will you confirm this is your writing? Combe, pale above his high collar, allowed that it was. And will you confirm, Fenn went on, mild as milk, that the figure recorded here, £11, 6 shillings, disbursed to the almshouse at Aldercombe, matches the figure you yourself entered in the original daybook, kept for your own reference? A long pause. Comb's hand went, unconsciously, to straighten a cravat that did not need straightening. It does not, sir, not precisely. Not precisely, Fenn repeated, and let the silence stretch until it had done its own work before he asked, gently, almost kindly, the one question the whole 10 days of preparation had been built to earn him the right to ask. Who instructed you to alter it, Mr. Combe, and how many times since? The room had gone very still, still enough that Lynette, seated beside the Duke at the front of the gathered chairs, could hear the small hiss of the fire and, absurdly, a single bird somewhere beyond the tall windows going on with its ordinary song, as though nothing in the world hung on a frightened clerk's next sentence. Combe looked, once, helplessly toward Lady Escher, whose face had not moved at all, and it was that stillness, Lynette thought afterward, the particular coldness of a woman who could not spare even a flicker of reassurance for the man about to fall on her behalf, that seemed, finally, to break something loose in him. Lady Escher, he said, and the words came out of him in a rush, as though he had been holding his breath around them for 3 years. It was always Lady Escher. She said it was only a small thing, only enough to keep a little put-by against the boy's future, since his father died before he could provide for him properly, and God forgive me, I owed her a debt from before, and I did not see how to refuse her twice. You are lying, said Lady Escher, and for the first time her voice lost its careful cream and came out thin, sharp, entirely her own. I have never in my life instructed that man to alter so much as a comma. Lynette rose then, before she had quite decided to, her father's daybook in one hand and the Dowager Duchess's letter in the other, and felt the whole room's attention swing toward her like a compass needle finding north. Then, perhaps your ladyship will explain, she said, and her voice, to her own faint surprise, did not shake at all, why the instruction to Mr. Combe, discovered by her Grace's own maid and kept these 3 years against exactly this day, is written in a hand that matches, line for line, loop for loop. 3 private letters you wrote to the Dowager Duchess the year of your marriage, which her Grace has also kept, and which I have set beside it for any person in this room to compare with their own eyes. She laid the letter and the instructions side by side on Fenn's table, in the light of the tall windows, and stepped back, because forensic proof, her father had always taught her, does not need an advocate once it is finally allowed to speak for itself in the open. The Duke rose beside her, calm as still water, and addressed not Lady Escher but the row of overseers. I do not ask you to take my word, or Miss Bray's, or even my grandmother's, in a matter that will determine the fate of every almshouse and hospital bed this family has ever funded. I ask only that you look at the 2 hands laid before you, in daylight, with your own eyes, and decide for yourselves whether they were written by the same woman. They looked. It did not take them long. Lady Escher, watching the overseers' faces change one by one, did something then that surprised even Lynette, who had spent 2 months building her case against the woman's cruelty and had somehow never once pictured her capable of grief. She sat down, slowly, in the nearest chair and pressed her gloved hand. Lynette noticed, for the first time, the plain gold band she still wore beneath it, the mourning ring for a husband 11 years dead, to her mouth, and when she spoke again her voice had lost every ounce of its cream and come out cracked and terribly young. "He left us nothing," she said, to no one in particular, to the room. To the memory of a husband who had died before inheriting anything at all. Julian died a marquis with no fortune of his own, and I was left to raise his son on the charity of a family that would forget us both the day Alaric married, and I could not. I would not watch my boy grow up a poor relation in the house that should by rights have been his father's. I did not do it for greed. I did it because I have buried one vein already, and I was not going to bury my son's future alongside him. No one in the room spoke for a long moment. It was, Lynette thought, the strangest sensation she had felt in the whole ordeal, to stand in the wreckage of a woman's cruelty and feel, quite against her own will, the unmistakable weight of pity settle over the anger she had carried for 2 months like a stone in her pocket. The Duke crossed the small distance between them and stood over his sister-in-law not as a judge, but, Lynette realized, watching him, as a man who had lost the same brother she had lost a husband. "You should have come to me," he said quietly, for her alone, though the whole room heard it. "I would have provided for Peter honestly, had you only asked instead of taken. Would you?" She looked up at him, and there was nothing left of the smile that never reached her eyes, only a bare, exhausted honesty that was, in its way, the truest thing Lynette had yet seen her do. I did not think a man could be trusted to give freely what he had not first been shamed into giving. I see now I was wrong. I am sorry for it, Alaric. I am not sorry for wanting my son safe. I will never be sorry for that. The Duke did not answer at once. When he did, he addressed the overseers rather than her, and his voice, though quiet, carried to the very back benches. "Lady Esher will remove to the dower house at Marrow, with an income settled generously enough that Peter wants for nothing, and she will have no further hand in the administration of any vain trust for the rest of her life. I will not see her prosecuted, and I will not see her son made to carry his mother's debt into a shamed inheritance. There has been enough ruin dealt out in this family for 1 generation. I would rather it stopped with mercy than compounded itself with revenge." A murmur went through the gathered gentry, surprise more than disapproval, and Mr. Fenn, gathering his papers with the satisfied economy of a man whose case has been proven beyond any further argument, allowed himself the ghost of a smile. "Then the trust stands administered as your grandfather intended, Your Grace, and the matter of the Candlemas deadline," he glanced, not entirely without humor, toward Lynette, "remains, I believe, entirely your own to settle." Coombe, weeping quietly with the particular relief of a frightened man released from a debt he had never wanted, was led away to make his own separate peace with the magistrate over his part in it, though the Duke, true to the mercy he had just extended, spoke for leniency there also. It was, all told, the longest hour Lynette had ever sat through, and the strangest, ending not in triumph but in something quieter and far more complicated, a family's wound laid open in daylight, cauterized rather than cut away, and a great many witnesses walking out into the cold Candlemas Eve afternoon, with a great deal more to say to their neighbors than they had arrived with. It was the Dowager Duchess, wheeled out into the last of the pale winter sun on the terrace afterward, who first noticed that her grandson had not followed the departing crowd, and who remarked upon it to no one in particular, with the satisfaction of a woman who had engineered a great deal more of the last 4 months than she had ever admitted aloud. He found Lynette instead in the estate office, returning her father's daybook to the shelf where it had first sat between his own account books that September, and stood in the doorway a long moment before she realized he was there. "You did not have to speak, in there," he said. "Fen had proof enough without your standing up in front of the whole county to be looked at. I did not do it for the county to look at me, Your Grace." "No," he agreed. "Coming into the room at last, I don't imagine you did anything, in the whole of this business, for anyone's benefit but the truth's, which is rather the trouble I find myself in now, since the truth has left me with no honorable excuse left to keep you at arm's length." He stopped on the other side of the desk, in the exact place he had stood the first evening she had ordered him not to disturb her pages, and this time he did not sit. "I said in September that I would die before I wed you, and I meant it as a shield, badly aimed, and it struck the one person it was never meant to touch. I find, now that the shield is no longer needed, that the sentence wants finishing rather differently." He reached across the desk and took her hand, ink-stained as it still was, and turned it over gently in his own calloused one, the way a man handles a thing he has only just understood he is allowed to want. "I'll die before I lose her," he said, which is, I find, the truer end of that same sentence, and has been since somewhere around the second week of October, though it took a great deal of arithmetic and one very stubborn ledger to teach me to say it properly. "Marry me, Lynette, not because Candlemas is 11 days off, and not because it would settle my grandfather's will tidily, though I confess it would do that also. Marry me because you wish it. It is the only reason I will take, and the only one I am asking for." Lynette looked down at her hand in his, at the ink under her nails that would never quite scrub away, and thought of a September evening and a library door not quite latched, and of how very far a single misheard sentence could travel before it finally arrived, transfigured, at the truth it had been carrying all along. "I keep my accounts balanced, Your Grace," she said, and heard her own voice come out unsteady with something that was, for the first time in months, entirely happiness. "It is the only power I have ever had. I find I am willing to spend a great deal of it on you." Outside the window a robin, the same one that had sung through every dusk of that long autumn's ledger work, took up its evening song as though it had been waiting, patiently, for exactly this cue. The banns were read at Aldercombe Parish Church on the first Sunday of Advent that followed, and the second, and the third, in a plain, cold building filled past its ordinary capacity with a congregation that had, 4 months earlier, been perfectly prepared to believe a plain steward's daughter guilty of forging her own father's honest ledgers, and who now craned forward each Sunday to hear the vicar read her name beside a duke's with an eagerness that would have astonished them all the previous September. The wedding itself, held the week after Candlemas in the same small church, was deliberately, defiantly, quiet by contrast. No crush of carriages, no announcement in the London papers beyond the bare necessary notice. Only the Dowager Duchess wheeled to the front pew in her best black lace, Mrs. Sedley weeping without shame into a handkerchief she had brought for exactly that purpose, and had been threatening to use for a fortnight, and Miss Cordelia Fairfax, invited at Lynette's own insistence, standing witness beside a young trustee's nephew she had lately taken a considerable interest in. A match Lynette privately suspected owed a good deal to the two of them comparing notes on the particular cruelty of a woman who smiled at roses that were not worth admiring. Mr. Fenn gave the bride away, since she had no father living to do it, and read the register afterward with the same dry satisfaction he brought to any properly executed document. Lady Esher did not attend, and no one expected her to. She wrote instead, from the Dower House at Marrow, a short letter to the Duke wishing him joy in a hand that had, Lynette noted without rancour when she was shown it, gone back to being entirely her own, unhidden, unforged. The hand of a woman no longer obliged to write herself into someone else's ledger. Mr. Coombe, spared the worst the law might have asked of him, took a clerkship in a neighboring county under a magistrate who had been persuaded, gently, that a frightened man given a second chance seldom needs a third. Peter Vane grew up at Marrow, knowing his mother's history only as a hard winter safely survived, and would, in time, become rather better at sums than either of his parents, a fact the Duchess Augusta lived long enough to find enormously satisfying. The Dowager herself saw 2 more Candlemases before she died in her own bed, with her great-grandchild's small fist curled around one ringed finger, having remarked, not long before, that she had engineered exactly one match in her long meddling life, and considered it, on the whole, the best sum she had ever balanced. It was very nearly a year to the day after the harvest supper at Rosemont Hall that Lynette found herself once more in the passage outside the library, a tray balanced against her hip out of old habit, though she employed a housekeeper now who would gladly have carried it for her, and heard her husband's voice through a door not quite latched. "I'll die before I let that woman set foot in my library again," the Duke was saying, and there was laughter under it now, easy and unguarded in a way his voice had never once carried in the whole of that first cold autumn. "She reorganizes my shelves every time she is left alone in the room, Fen, and I have given up pretending I mind it." She pushed the door open without knocking, because she had long since earned the right, and found him grinning at her over a stack of his father's old correspondence, his sleeves pushed back. Ink on his own fingers now, to match the permanent stain on hers, a small, dark-haired shape asleep against his shoulder, who had arrived that spring and already showed, the midwife swore. Her mother's exact frown of concentration. "You were speaking of me," Lynette said, setting the tray down and squaring its corners, from pure old habit with the edge of the desk. "I was praising you, extravagantly, to a man who has heard me do it so often he has stopped pretending to be interested," said Alaric, and rose to kiss her, unhurried, in front of Fen, who had indeed stopped pretending some months before. Outside the window, in the last gold light of a September evening, very like the one that had begun it all, a robin took up its ordinary evening song, and somewhere beyond the glass a bell from the Aldercombe church told the hour, plain and steady, as an honest column finally, fully balanced. If this story warmed you, if you found yourself, somewhere in the counting of those long autumn evenings, quietly rooting for the plain girl with the ink-stained hands to be seen at last for exactly what she was worth, then come sit a while longer by this fire, where the candle is always lit and the kettle never quite goes cold. Tell me, in the comments, which line you'd have wanted handed back to you at the end, the way Alaric's was handed back to Lynette. And if you'd like a chair kept warm for the next story, subscribe and stay close. I do love company on these long, unhurried evenings. Until then, sleep well and be gentle with the ones who keep your ledgers balanced when you cannot balance them yourself.